the guardian of the Solstice Fire, a tale of the Yule Goat. Before we start tonight's tale, take the time to like this video and subscribe to my channel to never miss one of my new stories. Settle yourself comfortably. Let your breathing slow. Allow the tensions of the day to drift away like leaves on a gentle stream. Close your eyes if you wish, and let yourself be carried back in the depths of a Scandinavian winter, when darkness wrapped itself around the land like a thick woolen cloak. There existed a village called Vinterdal, the Winter Valley. Here, in the heart of ancient Sweden, the sun barely crested the horizon during the darkest weeks of the year, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and midnight blue for what felt like endless hours. The villagers of Vinterdal, like their ancestors before them for countless generations, lived by the rhythm of the seasons. They understood something fundamental that modern people often forget: that winter is not merely a season to endure, but a sacred time of transformation, when the earth rests and renews itself beneath its blanket of snow. For over 1,000 years, Scandinavian peoples had celebrated the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, with a tradition known as Yule, or Jule in the old tongue. This celebration, which predated Christianity in Northern Europe, marked the turning point when the sun would begin its gradual return, bringing with it the promise of spring and new life. Central to these ancient Yule celebrations was the Julbock, or Yule Goat, a figure woven from straw and bound with red ribbons. The goat held deep significance in Norse mythology, where two goats, Tangrisne and Tangjosta, pulled the thunder god Thor's chariot across the heavens. These sacred animals represented strength, fertility, and the life force that persisted even through the darkest winters. In Vinterdal, as in villages throughout Scandinavia, the tradition had evolved over centuries. Originally, young men would dress in goat hides and visit homes, demanding offerings and creating playful mischief, a practice that anthropologists believe descended from ancient shamanic rituals where participants would embody animal spirits during sacred ceremonies. Over time, the tradition softened, and the goat became a benevolent symbol, a guardian that watched over the community during the vulnerable solstice period. This particular year, as December crept toward its darkest days, something felt different in Vinterdal. Old Astrid, the village's eldest member at 93 winters, felt it in her bones, a strange chill that penetrated deeper than the physical cold. She had witnessed many solstices, but never one that felt quite like this. At the heart of the village square stood the Solstice Fire pit, built from stones that had been there since anyone could remember. This was no ordinary fire. According to tradition, it had to be kindled from the needfire, a sacred flame created by friction, without the use of flint or steel. The villagers would gather on the longest night, feeding the flames with offerings of juniper branches and birch wood, singing the old songs, and keeping vigil until the sun returned. The fire represented more than warmth. In the old belief system, it was a beacon that guided the sun back from its southern journey, a promise that light and life would return to the frozen earth. The villagers knew, in the rational part of their minds, that the solstice would come whether they lit a fire or not. But they also understood, in a deeper place, that some rituals matter not because they change the external world, but because they change us. 3 days before the solstice, young Eric, whose turn it was to prepare the fire pit and gather the sacred wood, arrived at the square before dawn. What he found made his blood run cold. The carefully stacked wood was scattered across the snow. The needfire lantern, which should have been protected in its iron housing, was gone, stolen, along with the special friction boards used to create it. But most disturbing of all was what remained. Massive footprints in the snow, each one nearly 3 feet long, with 4 distinct claw marks at the end. These prints led north, toward the Bitter Mountains, where few villagers dared to venture, especially in winter. As word of the theft spread through Vinterdal, fear crept into every home like frost creeping across a window pane. Without the Solstice Fire, what would become of them? The rational-minded could dismiss it as superstition, but even they felt the weight of centuries pressing down, the accumulated anxiety of hundreds of ancestors who had relied on this ritual to carry them through winter's darkest hour. It was then that something remarkable happened. In the great hall, where the villagers had gathered to discuss what to do, stood the community's Yule Goat, a magnificent construction of golden wheat straw, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with proud horns curving toward the rafters and a thick beard made of the finest rye. It had been created by the village's craftspeople following techniques passed down through generations, techniques so refined that in 1966, the town of Gävle in Sweden would build a giant version standing 43 feet tall, creating what would become a beloved and frequently controversial Christmas tradition. As the villagers argued and worried, young Sophia, only 7 years old, noticed something extraordinary. The Yule Goat's eyes, which had been simple black knots in the straw, now seemed to gleam with an inner light. Its red ribbon, tied in the traditional pattern, began to glow like embers. "Look!" she cried, tugging at her father's sleeve. The room fell silent. The temperature dropped suddenly, and every breath became visible in the air. The massive straw goat shuddered, and then, impossible as it seemed, began to move. The Julbock was awakening. According to folklore, the Yule Goat existed in 2 realms: the physical world, where it was a beloved decoration and symbol, and the spirit world, where it served as a guardian of the threshold between darkness and light. Only in the most dire circumstances, when a community's faith and fear reached a certain intensity, would the barrier between these worlds thin enough for the guardian to cross over. The goat stepped down from its place of honor, its hooves clicking against the wooden floor despite being made entirely of straw. It turned its great head toward the north, toward the mountains, and let out a sound, part bleat, part wind, part something ancient and otherworldly. Old Astrid stepped forward, her weathered hand reaching out to touch the goat's flank. She remembered stories her own grandmother had told her, stories of a winter long ago when the Yule Goat had walked, when the village faced a crisis no one spoke of anymore. "The guardian has returned," she said quietly. "The fire will not be lost." The Julbock set out into the winter night, and despite the late hour and the danger, many villagers followed. They lit candles, dozens of them, protecting the flames from the wind with their cupped hands and glass lanterns. This candlelit procession wound through the village and out into the forest, a river of light flowing through the darkness. This spontaneous procession echoed an ancient tradition. In medieval Scandinavia and throughout Northern Europe, people would participate in light processions during the darkest part of winter. These weren't just practical, though light was certainly needed. They were deeply symbolic acts of defiance against the darkness, communal statements of hope and solidarity. The Yule Goat moved with purpose, following the enormous footprints through the snow. Behind it, the villagers sang the old songs, songs in a language that was partly Swedish, partly something older, words that their great-great-grandparents had sung when Sweden was still finding its identity as a nation, back when these northern lands were a patchwork of communities bound by shared traditions rather than borders. Eric walked near the front of the procession, carrying a torch he'd made from pine resin and birch bark. He felt responsible for what had happened, even though he knew, rationally, that he couldn't have prevented the theft. Still, it had been his watch, his duty. Beside him walked Sophia, holding her mother's hand, her small candle burning steady and bright. She wasn't afraid, not with the Yule Goat leading them. In her child's mind, everything made perfect sense. Of course the straw goat was alive, of course it would save them, of course the stories were real. Why had the adults ever doubted? As they traveled deeper into the forest, the landscape transformed. The pine trees grew taller, their branches heavy with snow that glowed silver in the candlelight. Occasionally, they would glimpse other creatures watching them. A white hare, perfectly camouflaged against the snow except for its dark eyes. An owl, silent and wise in the branches above. A fox, its red fur a shock of color against the monochrome world. These animals didn't flee from the procession. Instead, they seemed to watch with interest, as if they too understood that something important was happening, that the natural order was being defended. As dawn never quite came, for they were so close to the solstice that the sun barely bothered to rise, the procession reached the foothills of the Bitter Mountains. Here, the Yule Goat paused, its head raised, sensing something ahead. The tracks led into a cave, its mouth a black void in the white mountainside. Cold air emanated from it, colder even than the winter air around them, a cold that felt malevolent and hungry. Old Astrid, who had kept pace with the procession despite her years, or perhaps because of them. Some burdens grow lighter as we age, while others we learn to carry with greater grace, stepped forward to address the crowd. "What we face here," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, "is not truly a monster, though we might call it one. It is winter's shadow, the fear and death that come when hope is extinguished. In the old stories, we called such things frost trolls or ice giants, but they are metaphors made manifest. They are our own despair given form and agency." This was a profound insight, one that anthropologists and scholars of mythology have long recognized. The monsters of folklore are rarely just monsters. They represent psychological and social realities. The frost troll that steals the solstice fire is every doubt that whispers we won't make it through winter, every moment of despair when the darkness feels eternal, every time a community fragments under pressure. The Yule Goat understood this instinctively. It turned its head toward the villagers, and though it did not speak in words, everyone understood its message. "Stay here. Keep your lights burning. I will return." Then it entered the cave. Inside the mountain, the world transformed into something from a fever dream. The cave walls were ice, but not the clear ice of a frozen lake. This was ancient ice, compressed over millennia, filled with bubbles and impurities that gave it a milky, ominous quality. And within the ice, impossibly, were flames, frozen in the act of burning, their red and orange tongues captured mid-flicker, producing no heat, no light, only the memory of warmth. This was the frost troll's domain, a place where life's essential properties were preserved but neutered, where fire could exist without burning, where the appearance of warmth mocked the reality of absolute cold. Julbock's breath steamed in the frigid air as it moved deeper into the cave. Its straw body, which should have been vulnerable to the cold and moisture, seemed instead to glow warmer, as if drawing heat from some inner source. This was the magic of belief made manifest. Every candle burning outside, every villager who had chosen to follow rather than retreat to their warm homes, fed power into the guardian. At the heart of the cave, the passage opened into a vast chamber. Here, sitting on a throne of frozen flames, was the troll. Frost trolls in Scandinavian folklore are beings of contradictions. They are immensely powerful yet vulnerable to sunlight, which turns them to stone. They are wealthy beyond measure yet miserable, hoarding treasures in darkness. They represent the seductive danger of isolation, of withdrawing from community into solitary bitterness. In some tales, they were once human, people who chose cynicism and cold comfort over the vulnerable warmth of connection. This troll was massive, perhaps 12 feet tall, its skin the blue-gray of glacier ice. Icicles hung from its wild hair and beard, and its eyes glowed with a pale, cold light. In its enormous hands, it held the needfire lantern, the sacred flame still burning inside, trapped. "Why?" the Yule Goat asked, and though its voice was made of wind and creaking straw, it filled the chamber. "Why steal the light?" The troll's laugh was like breaking ice, sharp and painful. "Because I remember," it said, its voice deep and resonant with ancient sorrow. "I remember when I was one of them, one of the people in the village. I remember gathering for the solstice, singing the songs, believing that our little fire mattered. But it doesn't matter. The sun comes back whether you light your fire or not. The solstice is an astronomical event, not a magical one. I learned the truth, that your rituals are empty, your hope is delusion, and your community is just people lying to each other about how alone we all really are." This was the heart of the matter, the real theft. The troll hadn't just stolen fire, it had stolen meaning. It represents the voice of cynicism that tells us our traditions are meaningless, our rituals are empty, our connections are illusory. The Yule Goat stood firm. "You're wrong," it said simply. "The solstice would come without our fire, yes. But we would not be the same. The ritual doesn't change the Earth's rotation. It changes us. When we gather together, when we light our fire and sing our songs and keep vigil through the longest night, we aren't trying to command the sun. We're promising each other that we'll make it through together, that none of us has to face the darkness alone." "Pretty words," the troll sneered. "But I am stronger than words. I am older than your village, older than your stories. I am the cold truth that no amount of warmth can eliminate." "You're right," the Yule Goat acknowledged. "Cold is eternal. Darkness is the default state of the universe. But light is more powerful precisely because it is temporary, because it requires effort, because it is a choice we make over and over again. You think your cold truth is strength, but it's the weakest thing in the world. It's simply giving up." The troll roared and lunged forward, and the battle began. It was a strange fight, more symbolic than physical. The troll breathed its frozen wind, trying to extinguish the warmth within the Yule Goat. It sent cascades of ice shards, attempting to tear apart the straw body. It summoned the darkness, trying to snuff out the Guardian's inner light. But the Yule Goat held firm. With each attack, it thought of the villagers outside, holding their candles against the wind. It thought of Sophia's small hand clutching her mother's, trusting that everything would be all right. It thought of Eric's determination to make things right. It thought of old Astrid's wisdom, earned through 93 winters of surviving and finding meaning. The goat fought not with violence but with persistence, with the gentle insistence of life against entropy. It moved forward, step by step, drawing closer to the throne of frozen flames where the needfire lantern Saturday. The troll, sensing defeat, made one final desperate move. It raised the lantern high, preparing to smash it against the ice floor to extinguish the sacred flame forever. The Yule Goat leaped forward, an impossible leap for a creature made of straw, and caught the lantern in its mouth. But the impact was tremendous. The goat's body, held together by tradition and belief and the love of a community, began to come apart. Straw scattered across the ice. The red ribbons unwound. Outside, the villagers felt it. The candles flickered as one, and several went out. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Sophia began to cry. But Eric, seeing what was happening, made a choice. He thrust his torch into the air and shouted, "Light the torches! Everyone, share the flame! If one light fails, we become many." The villagers sprang into action. Those with torches lit them from the candles. Those with candles sheltered each other's flames. The light didn't diminish, it multiplied. The procession became a bonfire's worth of light, each flame small but together creating a warmth and radiance that pushed back the night. Inside the cave, the Yule Goat felt this surge of belief, this multiplication of light. Its body, which had been coming apart, stabilized. The scattered straw drew back together, bound not just by physical ribbons but by something stronger, the collective will of a community that refused to let the darkness win. With the lantern secure, the goat turned to the troll. "You can keep your frozen flames," it said. "We make our own fire." And with that, it breathed upon the needfire lantern. The flame inside, which had been trapped and dimming, suddenly blazed bright. Heat filled the chamber, real heat, the kind that brings life back to frozen fingers and hope back to frightened hearts. The troll screamed, not in pain but in anguish, the sound of someone who has realized they've been wrong, that they've wasted centuries in bitterness when warmth was always possible. As the heat spread, the frozen flames in the walls began to melt and, impossibly, to truly burn. The ice walls themselves started to crack and melt. The Yule Goat turned and ran, the lantern secure, as the cave began to collapse behind it. The troll, faced with a choice, could have fled deeper into the mountain, deeper into cold and isolation. Instead, at the last moment, it turned toward the melting walls, toward the newly freed flames, and let the light touch it. Perhaps it was destroyed. Perhaps it was transformed. Perhaps it was finally freed from its frozen prison of cynicism. The story doesn't say for certain, and maybe that's as it should be. We all carry a bit of the frost troll within us, the voice that says connection is impossible, that hope is foolish, that we're better off isolated and rulistic. What we do with that voice is up to us. The Yule Goat emerged from the cave at a run, the needfire lantern glowing in its mouth. Behind it, the mountain groaned and shifted, but not dangerously. It was the sound of ice melting, of frozen things thawing, of renewal. The villagers erupted in cheers. They surrounded the guardian, laughing and crying, their candles creating a circle of light in the perpetual twilight. The goat gently lowered the lantern to the ground, and Eric, understanding his role, carefully carried it, beginning the journey back to Vintadal. The return procession was different from the outward journey. Where before there had been fear and determination, now there was joy and relief. The villagers sang different songs, not the ancient, solemn hymns but newer songs, happy songs, songs about homecoming and renewal. Sophia rode on her father's shoulders, her candle held high, laughing each time the Yule Goat looked back at the procession with what could only be described as satisfaction. Old Astrid walked beside the guardian, occasionally reaching out to touch its flank, as if assuring herself it was real. "I remember now," she said softly, speaking to the goat or perhaps to herself. "My grandmother told me about the last time you walked. It was during the famine winter, when people were ready to give up. You appeared then too, and you led them to a grove of trees they'd missed, trees with nuts and bark that could be ground into flour. She said you always come when we most need reminding that hope isn't foolish, it's survival." The goat turned its head to her, and in its straw-bound eyes she saw recognition, continuity, the long thread of tradition that connected her grandmother to her to young Sophia, an unbroken chain of people who chose light over darkness, community over isolation, hope over cynicism. They reached Vintadal as the longest night approached its darkest hour, that moment just before the solstice when the sun reaches its southernmost point and begins, imperceptibly at first, to return. The village square was prepared. Eric carefully transferred the sacred flame from the needfire lantern to the waiting kindling. The fire caught immediately, blazing up with unusual strength and clarity, its warmth spreading through the square like a blessing. The villagers gathered around, all of them, even those who had stayed behind, even the skeptics who thought the old traditions were quaint superstitions. Because in the end, whatever you believe about magic or spirits or guardian goats, there's something undeniably powerful about a community gathering in darkness to create and share light. They sang the songs. They shared food, the traditional solstice foods that varied by family but shared common elements, anything with ginger or cinnamon, spices that warm the blood, dried fruits that taste of summer, nuts that represent the stored abundance of autumn, fresh bread that speaks of daily sustenance and the patience of rising dough. And as they celebrated, the Yule Goat stood at the edge of the circle, watching. Its task was complete, but something had changed. In previous centuries, the Guardian would have returned to the spirit realm at this point, becoming once again a simple straw decoration. But this time, perhaps because the need had been so great or the community's response so powerful, something different happened. The goat remained animate, but differently. It was no longer a spirit made manifest but something more mundane and yet equally miraculous. It was a goat made of straw that had been touched by belief and love and community so strongly that some spark of that experience remained. It could no longer perform great magical feats, but it could stand and watch and remind everyone of what they'd done together. Sophia approached the goat with something in her hands, a small straw goat she'd made herself, barely 6 inches tall, tied with a scrap of red ribbon from her mother's sewing box. "This is for you," she said, placing it carefully at the large goat's feet.
So you remember us. Other villagers saw this and were inspired.
Over the next hours, as the solstice fire burned and the celebration continued, they began crafting their own small goats from straw they gathered from barns and storage sheds. The villagers' artisans showed the children the traditional techniques, how to bind the straw, how to form the legs and body, and how to create the distinctive curving horns. This crafting of small Julbock figures would become one of the most enduring Scandinavian Christmas traditions, spreading throughout Sweden, Norway, and Finland. Even today, in homes across Scandinavia and among Scandinavian communities worldwide, families create these small straw goats, often without knowing the full story of why. They just know it feels right, that these simple figures represent something important about community, protection, and the light we create together in darkness. As the true dawn finally broke, the sun rising later than it had any day that year but rising nonetheless, beginning its long journey back towards summer. The solstice fire still burned, tended through the night by volunteers working in shifts. The Yule Goat stood in the great hall once more, surrounded now by dozens of small straw goats, offerings from every family in the village. It looked less ethereal in the morning light, more like what it was, a large, beautifully crafted decoration made by skilled hands, but everyone who looked at it remembered how it had moved, how it had saved them, how it had reminded them that their traditions mattered precisely because they chose to make them matter. Eric found himself standing before it, early that morning when most of the village was finally sleeping off the celebration.
"Thank you," he said quietly.
"I failed in my duty, but you didn't fail in yours."
The goat, of course, didn't respond. It was just straw now, just art and symbols.
But Eric could have sworn, just for a moment, that one of its eyes, that black knot in the golden straw, winked at him. Old Astrid joined him, moving slowly but steadily, a cup of warm spiced wine in her gnarled hands. "The thing about duty," she said, "is that it's never really about preventing failure.
We all fail sometimes.
The earth fails to keep the sun close, which is why we have winter. The sun fails to give us constant light, which is why we have night. Failure is built into the system. What matters is what we do when we fail, whether we give up or whether we gather our community, light our candles, and walk into the dark together to bring back what was lost." "Is that what the Yule Goat represents?"
Eric asked.
"Not preventing failure but responding to it." "The Yule Goat represents the part of us that remembers we're not alone," Astrid said. "The part that knows to ask for help, that knows to trust in something larger than ourselves."
Some call that part magic. Some call it tradition. Some call it community. The name doesn't matter as much as knowing.
In the years after that remarkable solstice, Vinterdal's Yule Goat became famous throughout the region. People came from other villages to see it, and the tradition of the candlelit procession became an annual event, repeated not because the fire was stolen each year but because the villagers had learned something important about themselves, that the ritual of gathering, of sharing light, of facing darkness together was valuable in itself. The large Yule Goat remained in the great hall year-round, no longer animated but deeply beloved. Children grew up with stories of the night it walked, though as decades passed, some believed it literally while others understood it metaphorically, and both types of belief were valid and meaningful. Sophia grew up and had children of her own, teaching them to make small straw goats each December, telling them about the guardian and about the importance of community. Her children taught their children, and so the story was passed down, evolving but retaining its essential truth. Eric became the village's firekeeper, a position he held with humble pride for 40 years. He never again lost the sacred flame, but he also never forgot that the true magic wasn't in preventing loss, it was in the community's response when loss occurred. Old Astrid lived another 7 years, long enough to see 3 more solstice celebrations. On her final winter, as she sat by the solstice fire wrapped in blankets and surrounded by people who loved her, she told the assembled village, "When I die, I want you to remember that I'll have had 99 winters. 99 times the earth tilted away from the sun, and 99 times you good people lit your fires and sang your songs and carried me through. That's not magic. That's better than magic. That's love." When she passed, shortly after the new year, The village mourned deeply but also celebrated a life well lived. And they placed a small straw goat on her grave, and then another, and another, until she rested beneath a blanket of golden straw guardians, all keeping watch, all remembering. Modern readers might wonder, did any of this really happen? Did a straw goat truly come to life and battle a frost troll? Here's the truth that matters. Something happened in Vintedal during that dark solstice. Whether it was exactly as described or whether it was something more mundane, a crisis of faith and community that was resolved through collective action, is less important than what the story represents and what it has meant to generations of people. The Yule Goat is real in the ways that matter most. It's real in every Scandinavian home where families gather to craft straw decorations together. It's real in the town of Gävle, Sweden, where since 1966, a giant straw goat has been erected each December, becoming a beloved symbol despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that it's frequently vandalized or burned. Because even its destruction and reconstruction reflect the story's themes of loss and renewal, darkness and light. It's real in the tradition of Lucia processions, where young people wear white robes and carry candles through the darkness, embodying light in the darkest season. It's real in the Norwegian tradition of the Nis, a small goat-like guardian that watches over farms and families. It's real in the Swedish tradition of Julbock figures that hang on Christmas trees and sit on mantles. Most importantly, it's real every time a community faces darkness, literal or metaphorical, and chooses to gather together, to share light, to create warmth, to persist. The winter solstice is indeed an astronomical event. The Earth's axial tilt causes our planet's northern hemisphere to lean away from the sun, creating the shortest day and longest night of the year. This happens whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we celebrate it or not, whether we light fires or sit in darkness. But we are not purely rational beings, and perhaps we shouldn't be. We are creatures who need meaning, who create stories, who build traditions not because they change the external world but because they change us. The solstice fire doesn't bring back the sun, but it does bring us together. The Yule Goat didn't really walk, but the belief that it could, the knowledge that our community values are so strong they can be personified and empowered, is its own kind of truth. In a world that often feels fragmented and dark, where cynicism is easy and hope requires effort, where isolation is the path of least resistance and connection demands vulnerability, the story of the Yule Goat offers a gentle but powerful reminder. Light persists when communities unite. Not because of magic, though there's a kind of magic in the community. Not because darkness isn't real, though darkness is very real. But because when we gather together, when we share our small lights, when we refuse to face the longest nights alone, we create something that is more than the sum of its parts. We create warmth in winter. We create hope in darkness. We create guardians from straw and belief. And we survive, together, until the sun returns.